Welcome to the webinar for Photographic Ethics, Module 2, Composition for Compelling Ethical Images. I'm your host, Aubrey P. Graham, and my contact is my email at aubreygraham@gmail.com. Please note that all images used in these 6 modules, unless otherwise indicated, were produced by myself. I hold the copyright to the images. Photographs cannot be reproduced, copied, shared, or otherwise repurposed without my consent. For questions on how to use any of the images shown here in other contexts, please email me at aubreygraham@gmail.com. So the goals of this particular webinar are to improve awareness and accuracy in creating well-composed images. And this is going to include getting into the relationship of the subject to the context within the photograph, looking at compositional elements, figuring out how to make the photograph speak, and thinking through the process of lighting and the decisions the photographer can make in improving a photograph by altering their relationship to the light. Further, one of the other goals is to gain acuity and control over the intended photographic narrative, and we'll go over what that means in just a minute, and to engage the ability to craft images that emphasize equity and global health ethics. This is going to be a slide with a lot of terms on it, but we'll go through an image with it, as you will see right here, in just a second. So starting from the very beginning, the frame is the actual space of the photograph. This is the boundary between what is photo and what is not photo. It's that delineating line between what is included in the image and what is not. Then you have the subject. The subject is the individual, group, or object that is the focus of the photograph. And this can be human, it can be inanimate, it can be a landscape, but it is what the image is focused on. Then you have the context, which are the surrounding objects, items, landscapes, people that give meaning to the subject. So if you have a person surrounded by a set of trees, then you will understand that you are in a relatively wooded natural setting and that person is doing something there, versus if you have the same person standing in an urban environment with skyscrapers around them, you will understand that they are in different places, probably doing slightly different things, and it will provide context. The excess are the items included in the photograph that exist in the image but do not necessarily contribute to the primary narrative. I consider the excess, which is often considered by Deborah Poole to be the noise and countenance of life that sneaks into these images. It might be the candy bar wrapper in the background. It might be someone's toes that are still included at the edge of the frame. These little bits of excess are not important to the main narrative, but they do shape and provide further context. Another of the key terms is the visual narrative, and that is the story that the photograph tells when it is viewed. And it is the story that the photographer intends the photograph to tell when it's photographed, and those two are not necessarily always the same. And then composition. The composition is the photographer's layout of the photograph, particularly in relation to how the subject interacts with the context and how the subject is featured within the frame. Now that I've given you all of those terms, we'll take a look at an image and think through them. So to think about the narrative, as I said, the narrative is the relationship between the subject, the context, and the frame. So here we have a photograph of Giselle leaning up against a 4x4 in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Giselle, this young woman wearing a pink sweater and a black headscarf, is the subject of the photograph. She is the reason this photograph is taken. The frame itself is the blue edge, and I've highlighted that here so that you can see that there's certainly more to the scene. If you were to turn left or right or look up or down, you would see more than you can see in this photograph. But as the photographer, I've chosen just to feature this segment of reality, and that is what is within the frame. And then you have the context. The car is part of the context. That cement wall with the large brown door on it over here is also part of the context. These people sitting in chairs in the back with the other wall back there, what looks like a classroom, which it is, a classroom, even the writing on the windshield, all of that is context that tells us something about the narrative here. And when I tend to show people this photograph and talk about narrative, I ask them to guess what is going on in this image. And that is what narrative is. It's the answer to what's going on here. What do you see? And there are many answers, but the narrative that I intended to show is that there's this young woman who has a relationship with this car and who is in a situation where there is education going on. So as it turns out, Giselle is a mechanic, and she learned auto mechanic work from this school, which is an NGO in the Eastern DRC, and she's doing her job. So while one might see something different and have a different narrative just from viewing, the one the photographer intends to create is important to keep in mind, because photographs aren't created willy-nilly. They're not random. They all have a purpose, especially when one is shooting with FETPs and the programs, or for TEPHINET. So in this case, again, you have a number of individuals. Your subject is going to be right here. It's this interaction between the woman and the man. And your context is, as you can probably see and figure out, that this is an ambulance. So you have part of the door that says Ulance, the other door is going to say Ambu, and you have people bringing their things with them. So you can understand from this that likely they are loading the vehicle to go somewhere, and that there is a medical issue based on the text that is going to spell out ambulance, right? So you're taking into consideration the subjects here, the context. You may also know that this is a somewhat rural setting, or it's not a super urban setting based on the house in the background. We can understand that we're in an area, if you know Eastern DRC, you might know approximately where this is, and understanding that this is a situation in which people are potentially traveling for a medical reason. So the narrative is coming through in that relationship between the subjects and the context given within the frame. Now, the excess is what's going on down here, which may be, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, is that another individual that is helping to load, which it seems is helping to load the car, based that might be a back leg. That's completely extra. As is, the tin roof over here. While it's used in the context to give us ideas, it's not essential to the narrative, but it's there. So that's going to be part of your excess. And all of this is going together to make a photographic narrative that is clear and simple to understand. And that's one of the keys here, is we don't want super complex photographic narratives. You want something that's going to speak very simply and very clearly to the viewer, so that it doesn't need to be surrounded by a lot of text to be understood. So before one photographs, as I mentioned in the first module, ethics are really important, and they come into play. So some of the tips for getting good photographs that are also ethical are to get closer. Instead of zooming on one's phone or with the camera, move your feet. Actually get up and walk closer, which then is probably going to require the second thing here, that you have to probably then talk to the subject. The closer you get, the more interaction has to happen. And in that, the request for consent, which we'll talk about in Module 3, must come first. And then in the process of creating these photographs, and we're going to talk about how to create good photographs, but just in creating any photographs, is asking the questions of, is this photograph representative? Is it accurate to the situation? Does it show and represent what it is intended to represent? Is that narrative telling the story of what's actually going on? And then ask yourself these other questions. Would you be comfortable with a similar photograph of yourself? Would you take this photograph in your own community? Does the photograph balance the need to show a situation and the humanity of the photographic subjects? And what that ends up meaning is there are certain points where taking photographs that show that things are not going well are important because they need to be shown, but that is a fine balance, because those photographs and the ethics behind them become quite delicate in maintaining human dignity, in showing people as they wish to be shown, in being equitable and fair and representative. So what is the trade-off? And this is something that there isn't a rule for, but it just needs to be kept in mind, of what is the trade-off between needing to show the situation and maintaining the humanity and dignity of the photographic subjects. So we're going to get into some very basic compositional elements here in thinking about ways to create images. So the position of the subject and the context is important for how we tell stories. Often, as you'll see with this photograph, with the European Union flag in the center, we take photographs with the subject centered, but that is not the only option. So the location of the subject in relation to the context can determine the story that the image tells, and can also make the image more provocative. So you have options of the foreground, the midground, and the background in terms of where to place the subject. So as you can see here, the foreground is that which is closest to the camera. And when your subject is quite close, you see more of them and perhaps less of the context. You have the midground, which gives you that really in-depth context, the where we are, what's going on in the space. And the background is often landscape. In this case, it's Mount Nyiragongo in the eastern DRC. So you have options of where the subject may be placed. These subjects, you can see the three men walking, they're approximately in the midground, but coming into the foreground. Were we to place them way up on the mountain, we basically wouldn't see them in the background. So where the subject is in relation to the context is important. Then you also have the options of left, center, and right. As I said, we often like to center images and put the subject in the middle, but sometimes, as you'll see in just a second, the images can be more compelling when the subject is on the lines of the third. So actually when they end up in these spaces, not like this photograph right in the center, but when they sit just off center, which allows us to see more of the context and understand a bit more of the relationship between them and what we're seeing within the frame. So here's one of the first compositional elements, the rule of thirds. This is what I just mentioned about these lines. As you can see, if we make a grid over the photograph, it creates 9 boxes. If we are to put the image and the person in the center, they're going to sit right in here. But it's been found that the most compelling photographs happen across these points of intersection. So right here, right here, right here, and right here. In those points of intersection, you are given the rest of the context. In this case, you understand you're on a basketball court and you have this player who's about to make a pass. In this case, you're seeing and your eye is drawn directly to these points of intersection, and it provides a strong narrative about what's going on in the situation. Let's take a look at another one. In this case, you have a woman walking in Kamongo, and you can see that again, instead of sticking her right in the center, we've put her off to the left and at one of those points of intersection. So your eye is immediately drawn, to her, here, and then you go up the road. Now, the next thing, which I just accidentally jumped to, is this notion of diagonals. And in this case, you can see that not only have we pushed her to the left of the frame into the rule of thirds, and we have our nice background up here, right, with the faraway trees. We have our midground showing us context of where she's going and the foreground of what is right here in the actual texture of the grass. But we have this really wonderful diagonal that draws us across the scene. Instead of just having a flat image, diagonals help give depth, clarity, and interest to these images. Diagonals can be very simple. They can be as simple as when you're taking a portrait at a desk, that instead of lining up straight, you actually create these diagonal lines that break up the frame a bit more. And as you'll see again, she's set on that third line. So if we were to put the grids here, her face would sit right about at one of those main points of interaction. Similarly, over here, we have a diagonal line in a COCO assessment lab. And you can see that the diagonal breaks up the space and makes it just a little bit more compelling and makes the photograph speak a bit more. Same thing here. As you can see, this one tells an interesting story because while we have Geraldine, this woman in the background, we also have this very rusted, burned roofing material and corrugated metal in the foreground, making it and the destruction the subject of the photograph, as opposed to Geraldine herself. Were she to be in focus and closer, she would be the subject. But by changing the subject, the narrative now is talking about destruction, as opposed to one that's talking specifically about her or the child back here. And again, we have a diagonal. So other ways to make the photographs speak and make them just that much more compelling is to really deal with interaction. Wait for those moments when individuals are working together, looking at each other, interacting with each other. As you can see here, that moment where he's reaching for the sticks and the woman is passing them over the back while the others are still working. Also waiting for eye contact. Eye contact is compelling. It's what you see when you're taking the photo. It's that interaction with the subject, and yet it's also what the viewer is going to see when they engage the photograph. So eye contact between two people or between the subject and the camera makes a very strong case. Though I would say that between two people who are interacting with each other is going to be your optimal option. Gesticulation, movement of arms, hands, legs, also will help make a more interesting photograph. As you can see here with the dunk, you've got that long extended arm. It's also a diagonal, and the ball is also in that rule of thirds area, making this a compelling photograph despite it having relatively minimal context, just the net, the ball, and the man. Here you have a lot more context, but you equally have gesticulation, you have concentration, and you see lots of context here. You have these people in the background, you have the hair that's being woven in, you have the roofing material, you have the windows. There's a lot to think about of what narrative, in terms of what narrative is created in this photograph. And then finally, this is the final thing that we're going to touch on for this webinar, is lighting. Lighting creates the image. Photography was originally an idea of writing with light. And so light matters in terms of dictating what that narrative is. It highlights, it hides, it shapes, it defines mood, and it tells the viewer where to look. It has the power to hide and expose information, and it can make or break the quality and the ability to read the image. Most importantly, though, the photographer has control of the lighting, within reason. The photographer always has the ability to change their position in relation to the light and therefore change its meaning. In this case, looking at this photograph, if we're thinking about the narrative, we can see three individuals, but also where the light is hitting is drawing us into the context and asking us to think as much about the space that they are in as what they are doing. If all of this was dark in the background and they were light, we'd be thinking more about who they are and what their relation is to each other. But in this case, it's drawing us into the context in a really intentional way. So if this very basic side, if you have your photographer here and your subject here, and this is your clock, the sun provides the majority of the light. Now, certainly inside, this isn't necessarily always going to count, but it does matter in terms of windows, in terms of doors, and in terms of taking photographs outside. So starting in the morning, 6, 7, 8 a.m., you have vivid, warm colors and long shadows. The sun is just rising. That's a wonderful time to take photographs that are going to be rich in their color. They're going to be vibrant. This often happens all the way up until 9 to 10 o'clock, where you have vibrant colors, you have good contrast, which is that distinction between the darks and the lights. And then at noon, you have to be careful, especially on a sunny day, because you'll have strong sun from above, which means high contrast, which means deep shadows and bright whites. And often this is not the best time of day to be photographing, but it is a common time of day to be photographing when one is in the field, because of course around noon one is usually working. Then from 2 to 4, you come back to as the sun starts to go down a bit, you have vibrant colors, you have some shadows and silhouetting. If your subject's right here and your sun is legitimately here, you will get a little bit of a silhouette because the light is behind the subject. But by the time it's 5 or 6 o'clock, if the photographer is still in the same position to the subject and the sun is directly behind them, they will have beautiful silhouettes, and so long as those are intentional, that's wonderful. So light comes in many different types. As you can see here with these three examples, you have flat light, where there's not a lot of distinction between the darks and the lights, and it's just not a very distinct photograph. That light is flat. Then you have light that is strongly contrasted. This is when, as I said, at about noon, the sun is up here shining straight down on your subjects. You have very bright whites, you have very dark shadows, and the image is quite difficult actually to make sense of at points because of those shadows. And then in the evening, around 4, 5, 6 o'clock, you have optimal lighting, which also happens in the morning or on cloudy days, where you can see rich skin tones, rich colors, and it's optimal lighting because the sun is hitting their faces directly as opposed to coming from above. And in that way, light can shape meaning. In this case, the light coming in from the door is striking this young woman working in her sewing machine, telling us that she's an important part of the story. It's not just about the space, but in fact, the photographer wants you to think about her. Here, with this young man standing on top of these cement bleachers, you can see that he's silhouetted. So who he is and his identifiable features are less important than the context of the roofs, the bleachers themselves, and the sky. So he, as a person and an individual, becomes less the focus of this and more a generalization. He becomes silhouetted. Were the photographer to change position, were I to step behind her and photograph out the door, she also would be silhouetted because the light would be coming this way, I would be over here, and you wouldn't be able to see much of her back. It would just be a silhouette, as it is with him. Contrastingly, if I went over here onto these other bleachers, put the light behind me and photographed this way, we would have identifiable features of this young man, and the story would become more about him and less about just a person on top of the bleachers. So you can see that by changing the light, it is shaping the meaning. Again, in this case, you have light hitting this young woman. It shows us something about her. She is the important part of this image, even though we have people out here. They're blurry, they're not in focus, and we understand that somehow, because she's a bit in the shadows, she's separated from them. And the light and the dark, in this case, is starting to shape the meaning of the image. We're back to having Giselle here. And in this case, you have this nice bright light that's not, it's in the evening. She's walking home from work. And this tells us a bit about, it gives us a mood, it gives us a color. Things are relatively happy. And yet we go to the next image, which was, after a short rainstorm, only about 30 minutes difference in the image. And it's so much darker that the mood you can see between these two images, while the same walk and her similar facial expression, the mood has changed drastically because the light has changed. So darker images tend to produce a heavier mood, a less positive mood versus the very bright images that will convey optimism, positivity, and the like. So in terms of summing up composition, we have the narrative, right? That relationship between the subject, the context within the frame. You have the position of the subject within the frame, so in terms of being right, left, or center, in the foreground, midground, or background. And then you have all of these various ways to make more compelling images that tell more effective stories, thinking about diagonals, the rule of thirds, or the various ways with interaction and eye contact to make photographs speak, and then thinking about controlling the lighting and the position of the photographer in relation to the subject as a way of shaping the meaning of the photograph. Moving forward, now that we know how to create wonderful photographs that are going to tell effective, accurate, representative stories, we move on to issues of consent, of how to interact with the subjects to get the most ethical images, because everyone is as ethically informed as possible. So up next is Photographic Ethics, Module 3, the Ethics of Photographic Consent.